So I have notes here so that I'll be short and sweet and save plenty of time for Robin. I have the honor of introducing Robin because, as many of you know, we often function as a training partnership, and we've been doing that for a long time. As a matter of fact, our relationship deepened as a result of the beginning of the Race and Social Justice Initiative work in the Office for Civil Rights many years ago now. We had put out a call for all departments to create change teams. And I was charged with putting together the leadership training for those change teams and needed to develop a basic anti-racism class. And I was aware that Robin had returned to school and gotten her doctorate in white studies and race relations. And so we invited her to partner with us as a consultant in developing that training. And that's when our work as a training team began. And to this day, even though Robin left the city all 5 years ago now, right? Yes. We are still using that framework, the backbone of that training, to train change teams today. So over the years, I've had the pleasure of maintaining this relationship with Robin over the long distance between here and Massachusetts. And throughout the partnership, I've had the opportunity to witness Robin's way of moving through this work, her academic rigor, her personal commitment to putting herself on the line to break the silence about impacts of white dominance in U.S. culture. Her ongoing refinement of what you're going to see today is a very uniquely powerful way of addressing this difficult topic. Her relentless self-reflection and ongoing active cultivation of relationships with people of color to keep her work accountable. And I have benefited over and over again from her generosity of spirit, and I want to make sure and mention that, sharing her talent and her expertise freely and her loving heart, always with me and others who are journeying with her doing this work. So Robin's relational approach to developing anti-racism capacity and partnering skill have contributed immeasurably to the ongoing work here at the City of Seattle and elsewhere in the nation. So with the publication of this book, it's really exciting to be, because I can see her joining the ranks of other white activists like Tim Wise and Peggy McIntosh and Paul Keevil, and among many, many others, by her ongoing work speaking and now publishing in order to actively reach out and challenge systems from which they actually benefit. That's very powerful work. And in her work and the way she approaches it, she always centers backing leadership of color, and that has made an enormous amount of space for people like myself and others who get to partner with her to realize leadership in a completely different environment than in the one we normally function in within the structures in the United States. So this ongoing work dares others, this is for you, to become likewise activated and be propelled by an awakening awareness to challenge racial inequity wherever you have influence. And it is my hope for you today that that will be your experience, that you will hear this work, ask the questions that you need to ask, and leave this room better prepared, more motivated, inspired to do this work along with us. So please join me in welcoming Robin DiAngelo to the podium.
This is so cool for me. I definitely left my heart in Seattle. So I see a lot of really, really beloved faces out there. Some of you know me, some of you don't, and some of you have heard a little bit about my journey, but I think it's really important to position myself and how I came to be a white woman speaking primarily to other white people about what it means to be white. And for me, it started in Seattle about 15 years ago when I applied for a position as a diversity trainer and just thought that would be just a really fun, cool job, and that I was totally qualified for that job because I shopped at PCC and I drove a Prius, and actually we didn't have Whole Foods back then, but I always brought my own bags, and I was a well-intended, open-minded liberal. And so, of course, I was qualified to, lead other people in open-mindedness. And I applied for this diversity training position that was a result of a racial violation on the part of the Department of Social and Health Services. So the welfare department in Washington had been sued for racial discrimination. And they had been found to be way out of compliance. And so as part of the settlement, the federal government, and I like to emphasize those words, it was really intense, the federal government mandated that every single employee in the state of Washington had to have 16 hours of workplace diversity training. And so DSHS, hired a company, because this wasn't their area of expertise. They hired a company to come in and design and develop that training. And that company's plan or model was to put us out in interracial teams of 2 and fan us out across the state. And we had 5,000 employees to train. And so they hired 40 of us. And that was the position I felt qualified for simply by virtue of my good intentions and my niceness. And because everyone in a position to determine my qualifications was also a really well-intended, nice white person, I got the job. And as often happens, right? I was in for the most profound learning of my entire life on every possible level. So the first thing was, in no way did my open-minded liberalness prepare me to really engage with complexity around race. In fact, I think it's me, it's the kind of self-defined progressive who can be the most challenging, because the degree to which we see ourselves as outside of this, we will spend our energy resisting any association. And I'll talk about that a little bit when I get into the book, rather than really looking. So I'll never forget the first day of that. We had a 5-day train the trainer, right? So we get these 40 people together, and they're going to teach us the curriculum so we can go out and teach others. And the very first day, a white woman calls out, "All the white racists in the room, raise your hand." And almost every white hand in the room shot up. Now, I'm pretty quick, so I'm looking around going, okay, clearly this is the party line, and I need to raise my hand, but there's no way. I am not racist. I'm not raising my hand. And I didn't raise my hand. And I look back today, and I think, what a clever move on the part of that woman, because she just surfaced kind of where we were at, where the white folks in the room were at around how they understood what that question meant. And for me, based on how I was taught to see racism, that question didn't fit me. Today, I would raise my hand, but it means something very, very different. So that was the beginning of a profound learning curve. And then there was going out into the field with people that I thought would be excited to attend the trainings. And I was really naive around all this stuff. I felt like a fish being taken out of water. And for the first time in my life, I got a glimpse that I had a racial paradigm. I didn't even know I had a racial paradigm, right? I just saw the world through human eyes rather than most particularly white eyes. And the hostility with which people came to the table to talk about these topics just really took me aback, and especially when there was no one of color in their workplace. Day in and day out, we were talking to primarily white groups who were insisting that race had no meaning, that they were the ones at a disadvantage. And it was a sense of unreality for me, right? I kind of like, okay, something's going on here that's not rooted in reality, but it's real. The passion, the intensity, the anger, the resentment that these people are expressing is real for them, but it isn't rooted in what's going on in their lives. So how do we do that? How do we pull that off? Now, today when I'm with my students, it doesn't look like that. It looks like race has no meaning as they sit in white classrooms, in white workplaces, in white neighborhoods, in white schools. But it's very, very similar. And as the years went on, I began to see the patterns. And so a lot of what this book is about, or the way I talk about race, is looking at the patterns, the rules rather than the exceptions to the rules. So if you find yourself pulling towards wanting to kind of raise the exception, of course there are exceptions. But the more important piece is to look at what's really, really patterned. And that's what I'm going to focus on. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that I give this talk today, and we stand today on the ancestral territories of indigenous peoples. And this is a map of those territories before the boundaries that we now recognize as nations. So I'm going to go over the table of contents, so so you can kind of get excited and want to read it. And so you kind of see what I took on. So that introduction is me telling my story in a little bit more depth. And then I look at race in education, and it's not, this doesn't limit the book to education, but I see, because I am a professor of education, I see it as a primary site of the reproduction of racial inequality is schools and education. So I'm going to look at some of the stats of what's going on in education, and then I look at what are some of the unique challenges of race education. In other words, what are some of the unique challenges of trying to talk to people about racism? Does anybody notice there are any challenges? Let's check it. Okay. We'll look at that. And then I really am trying to build, somebody was reading this recently who said it's like brick by brick, which is really nice, because you have to, it is really hard to talk about, and you have to kind of build, how does this work? And we have to start with socialization. And most people, although they might have a academic understanding of socialization, in the abstract, we tend to feel personally exempt from the forces, or we tend to believe that whatever our parents told us and only what our parents told us basically set us up, right? So if our parents or our schools told us everyone's equal, we're good to go. Defining terms. So any of you who've had the RSJI one-day training understand that there's a difference between prejudice and discrimination and racism. This is why I didn't raise my hand when the woman called that question, because I did not define racism the way that she did and the way I do now. So I have a chapter on that, and then how oppression gets reproduced institutionally, and then of course we begin with what is race. When I read from the book today, know that for those of you that like a lot of the academic explanations and rationales and citations, it's all in there, but that's hard to listen to. So I'm going to try to pull out things that are more like stories, and I'm going to jump over the citations and all of that. But it's in there. Race is a social construct. I kind of trace the trajectory of this idea of whiteness over time in that chapter. What is racism? And then new racism, how racism reproduces itself today rather than the way it may have in the past. And chapter 9 is how race shapes the lives of white people. This is kind of the question, what does it mean to be white, that many white people have trouble answering. What makes it so hard for us to see this? I'm sure a lot of people of color are like, hello. Actually, are you serious that you don't get this? In some ways, yes, we are. Right there. And what are those barriers or filters that make it difficult? And what are those investments? Looking at intersections, right? I'm pulling race out and kind of focusing on it, but you cannot be separated from all of our other social identities. So this chapter kind of looks at how can you use that in a constructive way rather than a way that invalidates the power of race in our lives. Common patterns that I see. Popular white narratives. This is the talking back chapter. This was a really fun one to write. Kind of like, okay, all of the, I didn't own slaves. It's focusing on racism that divides us. Those really common narratives. I speak back to them in this chapter. And then a special note on white silence, because those of us who do this work may have noticed a pattern around the way whites will engage in a topic on race, that where they may be outgoing and take up a fair amount of space in any other context. When it comes to race, we can tend to go silent, and that's really, really problematic. So in this chapter, I look at all of the rationales that we often give for that silence and speak back to them. And then looking at racism in specific groups, because I'm really looking at racial literacy, but to be what I think of as fluent, you have to understand kind of the big picture of how racial dynamics work in the U.S., but then how do they work for specific groups? So the messages I've gotten as a white person for African Americans and Asian Heritage Americans and Latino and Latina, those are different. They're different, and so the dynamic is different, and the interruption calls upon different kinds of skills. So, and that chapter was co-written with various folks. Jackie Lorenzar from the Office of Civil Rights, Darlene Flynn helped with that chapter in different sections. And then basically, where do we go from here? Okay, so positionality is the concept that our perceptions are shaped by our positions within society. And these positions allow us to see and understand some social dynamics while obscuring others. And this is just an image I love because we all see the world through lenses, filters. And I'm focusing on race, but of course they're all connected. And I want to say that this work stands on the work of countless scholars of color who have been talking about this for a really, really long time. And kind of the dilemma of whiteness is that it often takes white people to say it for it to be valid, but we also need to say it. That's kind of a dilemma I haven't figured out a way out of yet, but I do have insight into whiteness that really only a white person can have, but there's insight into racism and whiteness that people of color have that I never will. So I do invite people of color to hold me accountable or to add or deepen. And then I do like images, and the fact that images are coming at us 24/7, millions and millions of images a day come at us. And so we could take an individual image and deconstruct it and say, oh, I'm not affected by that image. But there are so many, and they're so relentless, and they connect to what's come before. So we really have to take them seriously. So I'm in a way, a little closer. How's that? Better? Grabbing. I like to grab an image and freeze it so we can look at it. And here's one that I like to capture the concept of positionality. It's an ad for Costa Rica, and it says, constantly being discovered since 1502. So definitely from a particular position, Costa Rica is being discovered since 1502, right? And part of being white is it's almost always my group's perspective. There's a few other interesting things about this ad too. Of course, that wide open, empty space, kind of the availability of that family to kind of consume that space. So, I'm going to read a piece from Race and Education to kind of center this. The most recent data about U.S. teachers show that despite the fact that the public school population is becoming increasingly racially diverse, 90% of elementary and secondary school teachers are white. Almost half of the schools in the United States do not have a single teacher of color on staff, and therefore many students, regardless of their own race, will graduate from high school having been taught only by whites. These racial demographics are not shifting. 80 to 93% of all current teacher education students are white, and they're being instructed by a teacher education profession that is 88% white. This racial homogeneity is compounded by unabated racial segregation in schools and housing, and it may be hypothesized from these statistics that the majority of whites have not lived near or attended school with people of color, have had few, if any, teachers, friends, family members, or authority figures of color, and do not interact with people of color in any direct or equal way in their lives or in their teacher preparation programs. Yet, as evidenced in many studies, while most teacher education students live their lives in racial segregation, they believe that racism is in the past, that segregation just happens, that they were taught to see everyone the same and therefore they don't see color, and that being white has no particular meaning. Consider an exercise I use in my teacher education classes. On the first day of the semester, before I go over the syllabus or talk to my new students beyond introducing myself, I pass out a sheet of paper with the following questions and ask them to write their anonymous reflection. How racially diverse was your neighborhoods growing up? What messages have you received about race from your family, friends, schools, and neighborhoods? How has your race shaped your life? Okay. I tell my students that we will return to these at the end of the semester and pass them around, and then we will read them anonymously. And after about 10 minutes, I collect them, and then I tell my students I'm going to make some predictions. Okay, so these are my predictions. You grew up in mostly white neighborhoods and went to mostly white schools. Your teachers were mostly white. Race hasn't shaped your life because race is not important. You believe that people should be judged by their actions, not the color of their skin. The messages you have received about race have come primarily from your family. If your family was not prejudiced, then you were taught not to be prejudiced. If your family was prejudiced, then you rejected their teaching and are not prejudiced. Perhaps you had a friend, because the answer is always that you're not prejudiced. It doesn't really matter what precedes it. Perhaps you had a friend or two growing up or a family member who's not white, or you traveled outside the United States, and that's why you're not prejudiced. If there were few students of color in your school, they were your friends, or at least no one had any issue of them. Some of you felt that no one should get special treatment because of race and had programs such as affirmative action in mind. And perhaps you know some people other than yourself who are prejudiced or racist, but you don't approve of that. And further demonstrating how unimportant race has been to your life, many of you found it difficult to come up with enough ideas or interests to write more than just a few sentences. The majority of the reflections will add up to the same conclusion: race is not and should not be important. Now, my students tell me later when they like me, they don't like me at first, that they were very irritated when I did this, because they had just written that very thing, and it really was not very comfortable for them. So let's look at just, these are very, very representative of their answers and to the extent of their answers, so they're not edited. My neighborhood growing up was not racially diverse at all, and every family in my neighborhood was also Caucasian. Throughout my time in school, I've continually been taught that skin does not matter. I think it's so interesting in all white schools that we were taught that race doesn't matter, or we think we were taught that. And these just go on. I think this one is also indicative of those that have a lot of contradictions in them. My first neighborhood racially was pretty, not meaning nice, diverse. These being apartments, you could find different races. My second neighborhood where I live now is not very racially diverse. Messages, not really any. Impact, I don't know. And I'll read the last one. My neighborhood was not racially diverse at all growing up. Maybe freshman year of college was when diversity appeared, yet still very small. I'm not sure how race shapes my life. And he just ends with, I'm constantly hearing racial slurs or people using the race card, that it just makes me thankful for who I am. I don't have to deal with that. So you have a subtext of what I call racial innocence, and the contradiction of clearly there's racial discourse that goes on all the time around us, and at the same time, simultaneously, we maintain that we don't know anything. Okay. I teach in an education program that is 97% white, and it's rare for me to have any students of color in my classes. Thus, this typical insistence that race doesn't matter comes from white students sitting in an all-white classroom who grew up in primarily white neighborhoods and attended primarily white schools and are currently being taught by a virtually all-white faculty, including me. These racial realities testify to a society separated by race, yet how do so many white people manage to position race as meaningless, even as we live, work, study, play, love in racial segregation? So I open each chapter with some of these quotes that kind of frames the book. Hey, but you're wondering what those planets are doing up there. So, as we all pretty much, we had a little chuckle in here, it's very difficult to talk about race and racism, and I like metaphors. I think they work, and I had been working on this one for a while to kind of capture what it's like for me as somebody with a doctorate in race relations, in addition to my personal practice and my work, and still the kind of resistance. So, race is one among the most emotionally and politically charged issues in society. And at the same time that most whites have a very limited understanding of race and racism, I have never met a white person who does not have an opinion on race and racism. Has anybody in here ever met anyone without an opinion on race and racism? Okay. In fact, I have seldom met a white person who didn't have a strong emotional opinion on race and racism. If you are white and are unsure that white people have strong opinions about race, at your next family dinner or social gathering, somebody told me to be funny, and I didn't think I could do it, but I guess it's working. Ask a direct question about race. For example, I'm reading a book on what it means to be white. What do you think it means to be white? Or perhaps, how do you think race shapes white people's lives? Or even simply, what are your thoughts on race? Try to move people past superficial and trite answers. I don't think it means anything. I see people as humans. By continually asking them to say more about that and see what happens. The direct question itself will make many white people uncomfortable, and most will start out with the usual declarations that it doesn't or shouldn't mean anything. As you continue to probe, however, you will likely begin to see the emotions concealed just beneath the surface: discomfort or anxiety or anger or resentment. These emotions are an indicator that there's more going on than our initial responses would imply, and much of this book will address this below the surface level. But for now, consider the surface level of race dynamics for whites, our opinions. Any white person living in the United States will develop opinions about race simply by swimming in the water of our culture. But these opinions will necessarily be superficial because mainstream society, schools, media, films, family discussions, addresses race in very superficial ways. Okay, so consider, for example, other fields of social science such as anthropology, archaeology, economics, geography, history, linguistics, and political science. Although I have opinions, thoughts, ideas, assumptions about each of these fields, I also understand that my opinions are based on the most elementary understanding. I would not presume to offer these opinions to scholars in the fields, knowing that I would embarrass myself in my ignorance. I would acknowledge their expertise and seek to learn from them by asking questions. All right, so try this thought experiment. You are in a course that fulfills a university science requirement. The professor holds a PhD in astronomy. He has written several books and is widely published in peer-reviewed journals and has a national reputation in his field. The course objectives include defining physical concepts, terms, gaining an understanding of the physical nature of various astronomical bodies and phenomena, and exposure to the practices, methodology, and conceptual basis of the modern physical science of astronomy. The professor is presenting the established theory in the field. He raises the issue of the number of planets and states that, based on currently accepted criteria for constituting a planet, there are officially 8 planets. One of the students raises his hand and insists that there are 9 planets, because that is what he learned in school, and he has seen many books with pictures of the planets, and there are always 9. He had a map of the sky in his bedroom as a child, and it showed 9 planets. Further, he says, his parents taught him that there were 9 planets, and many of his friends also agree that there are 9 planets. When the professor tries to explain to the student that to engage with the planet controversy, one must first demonstrate understanding of the criteria for what constitutes a planet, he is cut off by the student, who declares, "Well, that's your opinion. My opinion is that there's 9. The professor tries once more to explain that there are scientific criteria for classifying celestial bodies as planets, and although at one time the scientific community believed that Pluto qualified, with further study they now understand that it doesn't, in large part based on its shape, to which the student replies, "I don't care what Pluto is shaped like. I don't care if it's shaped like a diamond or a triangle or a banana. It's a planet, and there are 9 planets." Do you imagine that this student would be seen as credible by the rest of the class? Would the class admire him for standing up to the professor and expressing the same opinions they held? Even if his peers did share his opinion, would that make his argument credible? Or is it more likely that he would be seen at the minimum as immature, not particularly bright, and even somewhat disrespectful? Would it be assumed that he might have trouble passing the class? Most people would not see the student as credible or seek to align themselves with him. But something interesting happens to our humility when the topic is race. Like this student, many of us feel completely confident, indeed even a bit righteous, about sharing our opinions. And like the student above, we cite anecdotal evidence and family teachings to support it. But when we understand how complex race relations are, we may realize that our opinions on race and racism, unless supported by ongoing cross-racial relationships, study, continuing education, self-knowledge, and reflection, are as naive and ignorant as those of this hypothetical astronomy student. For example, I have had some version of the following interaction many times. I'm in the grocery store, usually PCC, and as we catch up, I tell them I have earned my doctorate in whiteness studies. I've seen somebody I haven't seen in years, and since the last I saw them, and I now research, write, and teach on the topic of race. Invariably, they will reply with some form of this platitude. What do you think? Oh, people just need to, yeah, we could fill it in, right? Get over it, get along, take responsibility, lighten up, see each other as individuals. Okay. Rarely does anyone ask me my thoughts on the topic or what I've learned or what the latest theory or research is. And I can't help but notice that we are usually surrounded by white people in a grocery store that is in a primarily white neighborhood, and that the person who just gave me the one-sentence answer leads a primarily white life. So your common sense opinions alone, if you are white, are not enough to enable you to really engage with complexity. Okay, so in order to meet the challenges, I offer the following reminders, right? A strong opinion is not the same as informed knowledge. The strength of our opinions is not testimony to their validity. Okay? There's a difference between agreement and understanding. When discussing complex social and institutional dynamics such as racism, consider whether I don't agree may actually mean I don't understand. We have a deep interest in denying those forms of oppression which benefit us. We may also have an interest in denying forms of oppression that harm us. Racism goes beyond individual attentions to collective group patterns. We don't have to be aware of racism in order for it to exist. Our racial position, whether we're white, person of color, or multiracial, will greatly affect our ability to see racism. And putting our effort into protecting rather than expanding our current worldview prevents our intellectual and emotional growth. And I mean, the fact that I had to spend the whole opening chapter setting up that kind of preemptive, I mean, I think speaks to how difficult it is to talk about this. It is very fascinating what happens when it comes to race. And I think that the emotions, of course, would belie the claim that it's meaningless. So how many are familiar with Marilyn Frye's birdcage metaphor? Okay, not too many. It's really beautiful. I have a really detailed chapter on how institutional oppression works. It's a concept we probably have all recited, but it is hard to wrap your mind around what it means to say that oppression reproduces institutionally. And I think she's got a really beautiful metaphor for that I would like to read you. So scholar Marilyn Frye uses the metaphor of a birdcage to describe the interlocking forces of oppression. If you stand close to a birdcage to press your face against the wires, your perception of the bars will disappear, and you will have an almost unobstructed view of the bird. So notice in this picture, the close-up, they're wider apart, and in the background, further away from the viewer, the bars are more closely spaced. If you turn your head to examine one wire of the cage closely, you will not be able to see the other wires. If your understanding of the cage is based upon this myopic view, you may not understand why the bird doesn't just go around the single wire and fly away. You might even assume that the bird liked or chose its place in the cage, which from this distance wouldn't appear as a cage at all. But if instead of taking a close-up view, you step back and took a wider view, you will begin to see that the wires come together in an interlocking pattern, a pattern that works to hold the bird firmly in place. It now becomes clear that a network of systematically related barriers surrounds the bird. Taken individually, none of these barriers would be that difficult for the bird to get around. But because they interlock with each other, they thoroughly restrict the bird. The birdcage metaphor helps us to understand why oppression can be so hard to see and recognize. We have a limited view. Without recognizing how our position in relation to the bird defines how much of the cage we can see, we rely on single situations, exceptions, and anecdotal evidence for our understanding. Okay. Dominant groups, because of their social and institutional positions, necessarily have the most limited or myopic view of society, but because they control the institutions, they have the means to legitimize their view and impose it on others. Minoritized groups often have the widest view of society in that they must understand both their own and the dominant group's perspective. In order to succeed in dominant group culture, they must develop what race scholar W.E.B. Du Bois, writing in 1903, termed double consciousness. So new racism is a term to describe the ways in which racism has morphed over time, how it is that my students can each individually feel exempt from the forces, could each individually say they absolutely do not support racism, and still sit in almost complete segregation as they insist that there's no relationship. And it doesn't look the way that it did when I was growing up. And basically the term means ways in which racism has adapted so that it has similar results without appearing to be explicitly racist. Okay, and I think that the binary and individualism are probably the primary ways that white people maintain an unconsciousness about racism and a resistance to understanding it. So the way that I grew up was to see racism as either or, right? Good, bad. So if you're racist, you're bad, right? And we can fill this in. You're ignorant, you're bigoted, you're prejudiced, you're mean-spirited, you're old, right? And you're Southern. And if I had an image, you'd be driving a pickup truck, because there's some classism in here too, right? Okay. And if you're not racist, you're good. You're a good person, okay? And you're educated and progressive and open-minded and well-intended and young, and I hope that goes on there, and Northern, okay? And if you listen to the way most people talk about racism, you will see that these are the anchors of their understanding. This is a primary way that white people have been taught to conceptualize racism, and it is a fantastically effective way to keep us from understanding it and to keep us very, very, very defensive and resistant to looking at it. Because what we hear is, you are a bad person. And it's such a groove. I mean, I can say this and we can sit here, but if I were to turn to the room and say, excuse me, but what you're doing right now is racially problematic, you would probably still freeze up and here, get defensive and want to do everything you could to convince me that you weren't doing anything racially problematic, right? To save face. Okay. So that's very problematic because it obscures the reality of racism as a system that's embedded in everything. Okay. But the other thing that this binary does is the way we see the world drives our action in the world. This is why theory is so important. This is why the way I understood what that woman was asking when she said all the white racists raised their hand was fundamental to how I engaged. Okay? Because the way we see the world drives our action in the world. So if this is my primary conceptualization and I'm not racist, what further action is required of me? Regarding Nancy Langdon? None, right? Good to go. Don't need that workshop. Already took that. Took it at Evergreen. No. You know, this idea that we're kind of covered and that, you know, there really isn't anything, not our issue, and we're not part of it, and there's nothing else to do. So it's not going to compel us to really challenge it. So it's actually quite clever because it looks like positive, right? It looks positive. Similar to like colorblind racism looks positive. So colorblind racism, I think most people know, do most people know what that came from and what is meant by colorblind racism? You guys feel, okay, it's hard to ask the whole room, should I go for it? Okay. So basically, prior to the civil rights movement, for the most part, white people didn't have to feel bad about their racism, right? They didn't have to say, oh, racists are bad and not racists are good. It was fairly socially acceptable to just come out and say, well, yes, we are superior, right? But after the civil rights movement, that was less acceptable. And so racism had to morph into and adapt, and I think the binary is one of the key ways that adapt, and colorblind racism is one of the key ways. So one of the common strategies of dominant culture is to take movements for social change, kind of strip them of their politics, and then end up using them to minimize the original cause. So Martin Luther King, in his speech for March on Washington, this was a speech given for economic justice. And he did not say, the answer to racism is pretend you don't notice. He didn't say, you know, when the day comes. He said, someday I want to live in a world where that doesn't matter, but we don't live in that world, and we actually have to do some really concrete things to get there. but it became that soundbite. Let's just pretend that it doesn't matter. Okay. So that's another form of new racism. So sociologist Joe Fegan has this concept of the white racial frame, and that's the deeply internalized framework through which whites make racial meaning. Even as I say this, I understand that a lot of whites actually don't think they have a frame, or their frame they think is like kind of open-mindedness or good or that kind of thing. But this white supremacy is so embedded in the culture and is so relentlessly socializing us that you can't miss it or avoid it. And it, he talks about them as little bits that cohere to other bits that get reinforced and they get passed down throughout society. And this is the image that I think nicely captures that. And notice that it doesn't say the United States, which would be problematic in itself, but the world, right? And you don't have to read Vogue magazine. If you pass this cover, it's operating on you, right? And I think that cover really nicely captures this relentless message of white superiority, white centrality, right? White humanity. So to get a sense of what might be below the surface of your conscious racial awareness, try this thought experiment. At what point in your life were you aware that people from racial groups other than your own existed? Let's think about that for a moment. Most people by 5 knew they existed. If you watch Disney movies, you knew by 5, right? Okay. Most people of color recall a sense of always having been aware, while most white people recall being aware by at least age 5. If you lived in a primarily white environment and are having trouble remembering, think about Disney movies, music videos, sports heroes, Chinese food, the Taco Bell Chihuahua's accent, Apu, the South Asian Quickie Mart proprietor from The Simpsons. Once you identify the earliest age at which you were aware of the existence of people from racial groups other than your own, reflect on the following. Did your parents tell you race didn't matter and everyone was equal? Why did they need to tell you this? Where did people of color live? If they did not live in your neighborhood, why didn't they? What kind of neighborhood did they live in? Were their neighborhoods considered good or bad? What made a neighborhood good or bad? What images did you associate with these other neighborhoods? What about sounds and smells? What kind of activities did you think went on there? Where did your ideas come from? Were you encouraged to visit these neighborhoods, or were you discouraged from visiting these neighborhoods? What about schools? What made a school good? Actually, what makes it good today? Who went to good schools? Who went to bad schools? If the schools in your area were racially segregated, as most schools in the United States are, why didn't you attend school together? If this is because you lived in different neighborhoods, why did you live in different neighborhoods? Were their schools considered equal to, better, or worse than yours? If you went to school together, did you all sit together in the cafeteria? If not, why not? Were the honors or advanced placement classes and the lower track classes equally racially integrated? If not, why not? What about your teachers? When was the first time you had a teacher of the same race or races as you? How often did this occur? When was the first time you had a teacher of a different race or races than you? How often did this occur? Most whites, in reflecting on these questions, realize that they almost always have had white teachers. They rarely, if ever, have had a teacher of color, and typically not until college. Conversely, most people of color have rarely, if ever, had a teacher who reflected their own race or races. Why is this important to reflect on in order to uncover our racial socialization and the messages we receive from schools? And my friend Anika puts it like this. We were taught by white people who 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 were taught by white people using books written by white people about white people. And it hasn't changed. Now there'll be a box in the book on the side. Right. And I want white people to get the magnitude of that socialization. Okay. So in conclusion, what does it mean to say that all people are equal but live separately from them? Our lived separation is a more powerful message because the separation is manifested in action while inclusion is not. You have to make sense of what is being said, but the power of what's actually being lived. And you do make sense of it. And a lot of this work, I think, for whites is trying to uncover how did I make sense of it, and then what informed that. Most likely you made sense of it from the culture at large, and that's guaranteed to be problematic. Okay. So this is the Academy Board of Governors who decide the Oscars. I'll just let you look at it for a minute. So this is under the section of new racism in the media. So media representations compound the impact of racial segregation on most whites' limited understanding of people of color. Movies, for example, have a profound effect on our ideas about the world. Key social concepts such as masculinity and femininity, sexuality, desire, adventure, romance, family, love, deviancy, and normalcy, violence, and conflict are all conveyed to us through the stories told in films. We can see the power of movies to shape children's desires, fantasies, identities, and play as early as age 2. Are any of you tuned into how influenced 2-year-olds are by films? Shrek and I don't know what else they watch. In many ways, it's become impossible to think and imagine outside the influence of movies. Now consider that the vast majority of all mainstream films are written and directed by white males. In fact, the 10 highest grossing films of all time worldwide were all directed by white men. Because of the racial segregation that is ubiquitous throughout all levels of society, it follows that these men are very unlikely to have gone to school with, lived near, been taught by, or been employed by or with people of color. Therefore, like many of us, they are unlikely to have meaningful cross-racial relationships. Yet these men are society's cultural authors or storytellers. Their imaginations, their desires, their worldviews, and their conceptions of people of color become ours. Consider the implications of this very privileged, homogeneous, and racially isolated group essentially telling our culture's stories. These implications aren't problematic because privileged white men are bad people. They are problematic because their worldview is necessarily very limited, especially regarding race. Yet it is virtually the only worldview many of us see, and it unavoidably and quite powerfully shapes our worldview. It's just a Vanity Fair issue on Hollywood actresses. So I want to look at 2 really huge films, and if you love this film, you might not be happy with me. So I'm not going to go through the detail of like what the story is. If you saw the trailer, you get it. I would argue that there's not a single character of color who is not problematic in that film, from the uppity lawyer to the incompetent social worker to the drug-addicted mother to the gentle, almost mute giant Michael Oher, as portrayed in the film. Okay. So the film, told from the white perspective and enthusiastically received by audiences, reinforces some very important dominant ideologies. Okay. White people as saviors of people of color. Some black children may be innocent, but black adults are morally and criminally corrupt. Whites who are willing to save or help people of color at seemingly great personal cost are noble and courageous. Individual people of color can overcome their circumstances, but usually only with the help of white people. Urban spaces and the people of color living in them are inherently threatening, dangerous, and criminal. Virtually all blacks are poor, belong to gangs, are addicted to drugs, and are bad parents. The most dependable route for black males to escape the inner city is through sports. White people are willing to deal with individual deserving people of color, but whites do not become a part of the black community in any meaningful way. And certainly I can't help but end when they can profit from their talent. White people who are willing to deal with individual people of color are morally superior to other white people. They're the good whites. When I've raised these issues with students, they often reply, but it's a true story. This idea that films can be true is a common one, yet no story in a film is a true story. There can only be ever based on events from a particular perspective. And many decisions are made along the way. Thus, whose story is the blind side? From whose perspective is the story true? Whose perspectives are missing? And what has been changed to make it more appealing to a mainstream audience who's come to expect those tropes? And I think this picture, I mean, for me, oh my goodness, this is look at this little white boy who's teaching him how to play football, okay? And he never really does get it. He just can't figure out how to play football, even though, look how tiny this boy is. But even I guess metaphorically, standing above him, he's got the clipboard. The body posture of both of them, I think, is really revealing of the relationship. So when do they finally have him understand how to play football? They appeal to his protective instinct by saying, imagine that your new white family is being threatened. And then, boy, he just mows people down out there, right? He figures it out really fast. And in the film, Oher, that's how I pronounce it, Oher, is that how you say his name? Oher, is discussed by white professionals as if he is developmentally disabled, and he certainly does come off that way. He's passive and inarticulate throughout the movie. His teachers note that on his IQ test, he scored in the bottom percentile in ability to learn, but in the 98th percentile in protective instinct. Now, as a professor of education who has never heard of a test measuring protective instinct, I have been unable to find evidence of this bizarre measurement. No, seriously, am I missing? I mean, I've spent hours trying to, like, what is that? It is highly problematic that Oher is a black male, is portrayed as severely lacking in intellectual abilities. Remember, ability to learn, 1 percentile, but exceptional in something instinctual. Okay? And his limited intellectual capacity is reinforced throughout the film. For example, when this little boy negotiates a contract for him with very powerful adult men while he sits mute in the corner behind the table. You guys remember that scene? This is really, really deep. This stuff's really deep. And highly acclaimed. So let's look at another favorite of mine, Lord of the Rings. Now, and you notice I pick very, very big, money-making, highly acclaimed, so we can not kind of deny that, oh, well, that's just a little, fringe film or something, right? So, Lord of the Rings won 12 Academy Awards. Okay. So, in Lord of the Rings, virtually, so there's all kind of creatures, right? So there's the elves, the hobbits, the men, they're called the men. There's another elf, wizard. Okay, 100% of every creature that inhabits the top of the earth in Lord of the Rings is white. So there's not even a brown face sprinkled in. In Harry Potter, they'll throw a few brown faces in there for a reaction shot. Or there's a black professor in Harry Potter that gets to read the Quidditch scores. You don't really know who she is, but she calls out the scores during the game. But there's not a single one in any type of creature. And they are literally trying to get to the White City. That's what it's called. And they're trying to get away from Mordor. And here's our hero. And then when the monstrous, evil orcs come up from the depths of the bowels of the earth, that's when we see this. This really, I think it's deep. And that most people don't notice is also very profound. It's not about we're bad because we didn't notice, or we should feel bad because we like the movie, but we have to notice that we didn't notice. And then the next thing we have to notice is, do we feel defensive about it? And do we want to argue, rationalize, or explain? And if we do, we've probably got the binary triggered. You see how that works, right? I can't tell you how many arguments I've gotten in over this. Okay. So this is a section on what makes this so hard to see. What time is it? And what time did I start? 12, so we should pretty much done. Okay. So I think I will read one last one. Which one should I read? Just a few minutes. Hang on, I want to. Segregation, I think, is also one of the most profound ways in which we come to understand what it means to be white and to actually to live in such a profoundly segregated context and not ever be taught by anyone who loves us, guides us, looks out for us, teaches us that we lost anything, I think is the most profound meaning of whiteness for whites, that there is no loss. And I grabbed these images of really, really major shows that all take place in New York City and that all convey idealized friendship, to convey that kind of message, ongoing message that there is no loss, that in fact it's the absence of people of color that makes those contexts and those spaces valuable. But I'm going to read one last story, because I didn't think I read enough stories. $2.15. Okay. So I was once asked to provide one-on-one mentoring for a white male teacher who had made inappropriate racial comments to a black female student. So they called me in to do some mediation with him. When the girl's mother complained about the comments that he had made, the teacher became defensive and the conflict escalated. The incident ended up in the newspaper and potential legal action was discussed. I will call this teacher Mr. Smith. During one of our sessions, Mr. Smith told me about his colleague, a white female teacher, who recently had 2 black students at her desk. She prefaced something she said to one of the girls with, or one of them with, "Girl." The student was clearly taken aback and asked, "Did you just call me girl?" The other student said, "Oh, it's okay, this teacher calls all her students girl." Now, in relaying this story to me, Mr. Smith expressed the anger that he and his colleague felt about having to be so careful and not being able to say anything anymore. They perceived my intervention with Mr. Smith as a form of punishment and felt that because of the incident with him, students of color were now oversensitive and complaining about racism where it did not exist. Can anybody relate to this? Okay. For these teachers, the student's reaction to being called girl is an example of this oversensitivity. And this is a familiar white narrative, and in this instant, it was rationalized based on the following. The teacher called all her students girl, and so the comment had nothing to do with race. And one of the students of color didn't have an issue with the comment, so the student who did was overreacting. The white teacher's response illustrates several dynamics of whiteness. The teachers never considered that in not understanding the student's reaction, they might be lacking in knowledge. The teachers did not demonstrate curiosity about the student's perspective or why she might have taken offense. The teachers did not demonstrate concern about the student's feelings. The teachers do not know their racial history. The teachers did not understand that actions or words that may be problematic with the dominant group can have a very different impact when used with the minoritized group. The teachers were not able to separate intentions from impact. In spite of the fact that Mr. Smith was so lacking in cross-racial skills and understanding that he was involved in a racial violation with potential legal repercussions, he remained confident that he was right and the student of color was wrong. His colleague, aware that Mr. Smith was in serious trouble regarding a cross-racial incident, still maintained white solidarity with him by validating their shared perspective and invalidating the student of colors. The teachers used the student who excused the comment as proof that the other student was wrong. She was the correct student because she denied any racial implications. And the teachers used this interaction as an opportunity to increase racial divides rather than as an opportunity to bridge them. Okay. And unfortunately, that's all too familiar. Like most of us who are white, they are culturally incompetent. They had an invaluable opportunity to increase their competency, but they used it to maintain their limited worldview. And they used it as an opportunity to increase their racial resentment toward people of color who raised racial issues. Imagine how the interaction could have gone if the teacher had replied with openness and sincerity, "It seems I offended you. I'm sorry. I use that term a lot. Can you help me understand why it's problematic?" It's pretty simple. Seeking understanding would not have necessitated agreement. We don't have to agree with or understand someone's offense in order to support them. However, neither I nor any colleague I know who's involved in anti-racist education had any difficulty understanding why the student reacted as she did. While the term girl may not be offensive to most young white women, it was historically used to demean and infantilize black women, so was gal, and as boy was used in the same way against black men, and it has a very different impact when used by whites. While most whites may not know this history, some humility about the lack of knowledge and the ability to focus on impact rather than intent would have made for a very different and much more constructive interaction. So just because of time, I'm going to stop reading there, and I think that we have some folks that are going to run microphones for you if you have questions or comments. And if you don't, I'll grab a few more chapters. I think she's got one.
So, who has a question?
She does.
Okay. First, I'd like to thank you very much for coming, standing here to talk about some of the things that I felt most of my life when I see on the television. As a black young girl growing up in the South, I used to live in the city. So I got a chance to live somewhat of a privileged life, if you will. But then there's going back to what you guys call suburbs, or some call suburbs. We call the country. So coming to the city, we saw white doctors, teachers, and I just thought they were just the greatest. But when I would go home, school books torn, teachers, they did the best that they could with what they had and what they were offered. But it is so wonderful to actually hear you talk about the things that I've watched on television commercials. We're not seen. If we are seen, we're last.
Yeah.
And it is so great to see and to appreciate you for bringing that out. Now I know that what I see, it's not a problem for me. It is reality.
Yeah.
So I thank you.
Well, thank you. And I'm sorry that takes, I know that's how it's set up, but that
Yeah.
it takes me to say it's real.
Yes.
Because we're taught to deny everything I just talked about.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
So I do appreciate that because I know emotionally I'm a little hurt right now.
Yeah. So.
But I'm sure others are too,
Yeah.
whether you look like me or someone else, because it's a very sensitive issue, but I commend you.
Okay, thank
Totally.
you.
Thank you so very much.
She's.
Hi, my name is Cheryl Muskelly, and I can also agree with Kimberly. I was hurt and ready to leave, because basically I'm from the South also, and I know your information is information that has been researched, but I disagree because you asked, there was a question as what is race, and I think you had Southern, Old. I think since I've been here, since 1990, the question is on both sides. It's Southern and Northern, and then when you think about what is not, it's Southern and Northern, because since I've been here, even just working with the city, I've seen racism, just within the city and on my job. So it's both Southern and Northern as far as what is race and what is not. It's southern and
Oh,
northern.
no, and actually, I absolutely agree, and I think you may have misunderstood. I was saying, I was taught to just think it was Southern, and to see myself, since I'm not Southern, that I don't have anything to do with it, and I'm challenging that idea, and I think that's a false separation.
Yeah,
So I
because
would
what I
agree with you.
see, you probably not think that it doesn't exist, but what I see in the north, in the northern, is hidden, but it's
Oh,
there.
no, yeah, and I'm trying to make it visible. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Vivian?
So can't see.
Oh,
Hi, my name is Cherry Briggs. I work for DPD. I'm Native American. I should say I'm Native, period. I really liked when you showed the map, that all of this land was indigenous people who lived here. And to this day, I just shake my head in amusement that people actually think they own the land. And when I see parts of it crashing into the ocean, I'm like,
I have a question, Robin, over here, me. Um, all the people of color are asking questions. Just want to say that. I love your book, both of them.
they got to read that chapter on white silence.
Yes. But my question is, I had this big realization when I was reading your book about status and the loss of status. And it's kind of making my brain go around.
Okay.
But because I realized that part of, in doing anti-racist work and working with white allies, I think one of the most difficult things for me as a person of color is when white folks start fearing their loss of status. And we talk a lot about privilege, but we don't talk about status. And so I just wanted to ask, because I know you're very good with this, but what are some of your strategies to kind of work through that when you start feeling that feel of losing the status and stay there as a strong white ally with people of color?
I can't tell you how liberating it is to just accept that I'll put it myself, that I have been thoroughly conditioned into a racist worldview. I've been thoroughly conditioned to be invested in racism. It's not just, gosh, something, I just get privileged, there's nothing I can do. I actually navigate, manipulate, the world with an investment in that privilege, right? I'm clear about all of that. And I'm also clear that I didn't choose that, and that guilt is just not my issue. I know that's really hard for a lot of white people. For me, it's like, okay, there's no way I could have not been set up to benefit from and to participate in it. And the only way I'm going to get out of that is to be able to recognize and interrupt it. And most people who are really struggling with saving face, that's I think how I put it, you said status, but saving face is because of the binary. A racist is a bad person. I will appear to be morally corrupt. I don't want you to see that I'm racist. That everything is informed by, at all costs, I must separate myself from racism. Otherwise, watching the patterned response of this just makes that so clear to me that once you accept that you couldn't have avoided it, it's actually something you enthusiastically want to see and embrace. Like, thank you, thank you, thank you. I want to see what I'm doing. I want to know what I'm doing so I can stop doing it. And some of that is me being honest and about what I already know, and other times I do need other outsiders to help me. But it's just, I don't think saving face is an issue if you're not trying to save this face that's connected to racism as a bad thing. You just can't, remember, that theory about the world just fundamentally changes it. This is why I often say emotions are political, right? And so what do some people are like, what do you mean? Emotions are pure, they're true. No, they're political. The frame you view the world through will impact your emotions. So if my definition of a racist is a bad person and you suggest I'm participating in it, my emotion will probably be outrage, anger, humiliation, right? Those emotions are real, but of course they're political in that the filter I have is what triggers them. If my frame is, it's not possible for me not to be doing that, then the feelings I might have, while a little bit embarrassing, will be gratitude, self-knowledge, kind of excitement even. I will have fundamentally different feelings based on that filter, that frame, and that's what I think the whole status is about. Does that help, Jackie? Okay.
I was wondering what happened to the teacher in the story, and then if you ever were able to get through to him, and then also if you have any suggestions of things that you found helpful in trying to work with people like that.
Well, unfortunately, because of the ways institutions work, they covered themselves by bringing me in, but they didn't sustain it. Okay, so I think without sustaining that work, likely he's defaulting. These are very deeply grooved patterns. Okay? So while I was working with him, there was progress. It was almost like a peak of him being really angry with me, and then coming down the other side and feeling like we could talk much better. But I'm not so hopeful because they didn't keep it going. And then, as I always say to anyone I work with, the moment you walk outside this room, the forces of society will conspire for you not to see this, if you're white, and if you're not, right? The forces, it's so difficult to keep seeing this, depending on how you're positioned in it, if you don't intentionally set up a network around yourself, you will default. And although I know the time went faster than I thought it would, and I left it sooner than I thought I would. There's a whole section of kind of where do we go from here. There's a wonderful appendix, kind of a checklist. I mean, there's a lot of resources in there. But the quick answer would be, you have to build the foundation of understanding what it means, what racism means. And as long as we think it means individual acts by individual bad people, we won't be able to challenge it.
Sorry, I wanted to acknowledge and thank you for the word you use, your usage of the word interruption when you're talking. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about that, because it's, just let you expand on that, please.
Yeah, okay. I mean, an interruption can be different things. I'm going to resist what I see as a really common, I had a little, you saw maybe some of my headings. There's a common pull for whites who are looking at racism to want to focus on the racism of other whites. Right, so you just tell me how do I tell my sister about this, or how do I interrupt, right? So I'm not gonna do that. I wanna look at how we do it in ourselves, okay? So, and I'm gonna use silence as a great example. So let's say I'm in a discussion or something's going on around race or racism, whether it be a deliberate intentional discussion or some kind of pattern in a meeting, and I see it, but for whatever reason I'm afraid to say anything, right? I don't want to break white solidarity. I don't want to get socially penalized. I want to be seen as a team player. There's lots of investments that keep us silent. I want to save face. I don't want to make a mistake. What if I say something and they think I'm racist? And I always just say the jig is up, okay? All white people are racist from the way that I'm talking about it. So when we just take that off the table, I don't have to spend my time trying to hide that, or that's different than letting it out in a very inappropriate way. But I mean, I don't have to try to distance myself from it and block it. So I ask myself, how is my engagement right now either challenging or upholding racism? And if silence, regardless of what informs it, if it's upholding racism, then I have to interrupt that silence in myself and speak and push through it. And so that's what those are my thoughts on interruption. Does that help? Okay.
She's going to him. She's going to him. And then you had a question. Oh, he's first and then you're.
My impression is that the lines of racism traditionally have been more determined by economics, that those who started with the most still have the most, and that even in other countries, when you have a genocide against other people, it's usually the most powerful force there is economic, and they use race as a tool to further their economic dominance. And so in America, you might have where the tradition is when we started developing America 50, 100 years ago, all the people were white and they had all the resources, and they still do at this point, the super rich or whatever. And so that determines where you begin. And I'm just curious what you think about that.
No, I actually have a section in there called "The Real Issue is Class," if we address class. And it is all about the distribution of resources, right? So in that, we could call the kind of core, the root of any oppression is how we distribute resources, and so we could call that class or classism. And racism is just a very, very clear, distinct form of oppression that all people, regardless of their class, should be looking at and then asking themselves, how did my particular class position set me up to collude with racism? So I grew up poor. So I could say, well, I'm equal to, in terms of oppression, I'm equal to a person of color because because none of us had class resources. But absolutely, my experience of poverty was different because I was white. And my tools for getting out of poverty were also really different because I'm white. And so I think you have to both look at them together and hold them as really separate constructs in our society and look at them that way too. And all too often, I see it as, used as a form of what I call channel switching. Again, for me, the question isn't like, is this true or is this not, but how is this functioning? And so when that question comes up, I would want to ask, so how is that functioning to take race off the table? And if it is, that's a red flag for me. Or is it functioning to add some complexity and for each person to be able to kind of calibrate their own socialization based on all their other identities? Does that make sense? Okay.
I have it over here. So I wanted to thank you for what you said about liberating yourself from the binary.
Yeah.
And that I kind of hold this idea that there's a sort of a wellness theme in there for white people as well, that it's a sickness that we're kind of participating in, racism, and that to step away from it is a step towards wellness, for one thing. But on another note, that the conversation that is typified often as difficult might be reframed as refreshing and new and fresh and actually more useful and more growth-inducing than other conversations. So I kind of fear the use of "it's a difficult conversation" too much, because then people don't want to have it. But it is actually a very refreshing conversation to have for people, and it's liberating ultimately for everyone to sort of get off that oppression wheel, whether you're the oppressed or the oppressor, and step away from it and find yourself in a happier place.
See, and I would say that anything that, hey, if I haven't said anything controversial yet, let this be it. If anything that makes conversations about race difficult are usually white patterns. We make those conversations difficult because of our patterns around it. And that's that whole chapter I have on common white patterns. And so that's maybe that question around interruption. How do I interrupt those patterns? Because I'm the one that's making it difficult, which of course serves me, because then we don't have them right there. Yeah. We're pretty much okay. 1:30. So I know there's a lot of that flew. Oh,
yeah. I forgot. I know there's a lot of people that had their hands up, and I don't know if we have a few minutes for people to hang around afterward to maybe ask Robin a question. But we need to, unfortunately, I hate to interrupt this. Anyway, it's time to go. So,
thank you.